My name is Olivia, and what I'm about to tell you will change how you think about love, betrayal, and the thin line between right and wrong. This isn't a story I'm proud of, but it's one that needs to be told, because sometimes the most devastating truths hide behind the most ordinary lives. It started in Dallas in a house that looked like every other house on Maple Street. White picket fence, manicured lawn, two-car garage. The American dream in suburban packaging. Ryan and I had been living there for 6 years, married for 8. He was a project manager at Henderson Construction, one of the biggest firms in Texas. I was a wife. That's what I'd become somewhere along the way. Ryan wasn't always absent. In the beginning, he'd come home with stories about his day, his eyes lighting up when he talked about the buildings he was helping create. "Look at this, Liv," he'd say, spreading blueprints across our kitchen table. "This is going to be a children's hospital. We're building hope, literally building it." But success has a way of consuming the very passion that created it. The more projects Ryan landed, the more his phone buzzed. Weekends became extensions of weekdays. Vacations were interrupted by urgent calls that somehow always seemed more urgent than the woman sitting beside him. I remember the exact moment I realized I'd become invisible in my own marriage. It was a Tuesday evening in March. I'd spent the entire day preparing Ryan's favorite meal, herb-crusted salmon with roasted vegetables. I'd even bought candles, thinking we could have one of those dinners couples have in movies, where they actually look at each other while they eat. Ryan walked in at 9:47 p.m., still talking on his phone. He gestured at the cold plate I'd left covered on the counter, mouthed "thank you," and disappeared into his home office. I sat alone at our dining room table, staring at the unlit candles, feeling like a ghost haunting my own life. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to start living again. The Fitness World gym on Cedar Springs was nothing special, rows of treadmills facing a wall of mirrors, the eternal smell of disinfectant and determination. But it was somewhere to go, somewhere with people who moved and breathed and acknowledged my existence. Chris Martinez noticed me on my third visit. Not in the way men sometimes notice women at gyms, not with hungry eyes or obvious intentions. He noticed I was struggling with the weight machine, my form all wrong, frustration written across my face. "Mind if I show you a better way?" he asked, his voice gentle, careful not to embarrass me. Chris was 28 to my 33, but there was something old in his eyes, like he'd seen more than most people his age. Later, I'd learn about his deployment in Afghanistan, about the friends he'd lost, about how fitness had saved him from the darkness that followed soldiers home. But that first day, all I knew was that someone was paying attention to me. "You look like you could use a friend," he said after showing me the proper technique. It wasn't a pickup line. It was an observation, delivered with the kind of kindness I'd forgotten existed. That coffee changed everything. We met at a small cafe called Luna's, tucked between a dry cleaner and a used bookstore. Chris ordered black coffee, I got a vanilla latte, a detail he'd remember for months afterward. We talked for 3 hours. About everything and nothing. About my abandoned dreams of becoming a writer, about his plans to open his own training studio. About loneliness and hope and the strange ways life disappoints us. "Your husband," Chris said carefully, stirring sugar into his second cup, "does he know how unhappy you are?" The question hit me like cold water. "I'm not unhappy," I lied. Chris smiled sadly. "I've seen that look before. In the mirror, mostly before I decided to change my life. I should have left then. Should have thanked him for the coffee and the conversation and walked back to my invisible life. Instead, I asked, how do you change a life that feels like it's already over? "One honest moment at a time," he said. Our friendship developed slowly, like a photograph in a darkroom. Coffee meetings became lunch dates. Lunch dates became long walks in Trinity River Park. Text messages started innocuous, "How was your day?" and gradually became more personal. He sent me photos of sunrises during his morning runs. I shared pictures of books I was reading, thoughts I was having. Ryan noticed nothing. Or if he did, he said nothing. 3 months into our friendship, Chris and I were in his car after a particularly intense conversation about my marriage. I'd been crying again, about how Ryan had missed our anniversary dinner because of a client emergency in Houston. "He doesn't see you," Chris said, his voice thick with emotion. "And that's criminal because you're—" He stopped, shook his head. "I'm what?" I whispered. "You're extraordinary. And you don't even know it." The kiss happened naturally, inevitably, like rain after a long drought. His lips were soft, tentative at first, then urgent when I responded. For 30 seconds I felt more alive than I had in years. Then reality crashed back. "I can't," I gasped, pulling away. "I'm married." "I know," Chris said quietly. But are you happy? The question haunted me for days. Was I happy? When was the last time I'd really laughed? When had Ryan last looked at me like I was something precious instead of just there? The affair began 2 weeks later. I wish I could say it was just physical, that I was simply a neglected wife seeking attention. But what Chris and I had was deeper, more dangerous. We talked about books and dreams and fears. He listened when I spoke about wanting children, about worrying that I was wasting my life, about feeling like I was disappearing one day at a time. Ryan and I had been trying to have a baby for 2 years with no success. The fertility doctor said there was nothing wrong with either of us. Sometimes these things just take time. But how do you make a baby when your husband is more interested in construction schedules than construction of a family? Chris wanted children too. Had always imagined himself as a father, he said, teaching his kids to throw a baseball, helping with homework at the kitchen table. The way he talked about it, with such longing and certainty, made my heart ache. We met at his apartment on Tuesdays and Thursdays when Ryan worked late. Chris lived in a converted loft downtown, all exposed brick and hardwood floors. It was nothing like the sterile perfection of my suburban house. His walls were covered with photographs he'd taken, landscapes from his travels, candid shots of people laughing, living, being human. "You have an artist's eye," I told him once, studying a black and white photo of an elderly couple sharing ice cream on a park bench. "I see what matters," he replied, looking at me in a way that made me feel like I was one of his photographs, worth capturing, worth keeping. The guilt was crushing at first. Every time I walked into my house after being with Chris, I felt like I was wearing a scarlet letter visible to everyone. But Ryan was so absorbed in his work that he didn't notice the new perfume I'd started wearing, the way I'd begun styling my hair differently, the fact that I was happier than I'd been in years. Or maybe he noticed and chose not to see. Maybe that's what our marriage had become, a mutual agreement to ignore the truth. 6 months into the affair, something shifted. Chris started talking about the future, our future. He wanted me to leave Ryan, to start fresh with him. He painted pictures with his words. Us traveling together, opening the training studio as partners, having the family we both wanted. "I love you, Olivia," he said one afternoon as we lay in his bed, afternoon sunlight streaming through his windows. "I know this is complicated, but what we have is real. More real than whatever you have at home." I wanted to say it back. The words sat on my tongue like birds ready to fly. But something held me back. Maybe it was years of loyalty to Ryan, or maybe it was the fear that what Chris and I had was built on the foundation of my broken marriage, beautiful, but not designed to last. That's when Ryan's world started falling apart. It began with a phone call at 2 a.m. on a Wednesday in October. Ryan's voice was shaking when he answered, and I watched his face crumble as he listened to whoever was on the other end. "Dad had a heart attack," he said when he hung up. "A massive one. They don't know if he's going to make it." I'd never seen Ryan cry before. Not when we lost our first pregnancy to miscarriage. Not when his company nearly went bankrupt 3 years earlier. But that night, he sobbed in my arms like a lost child, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years, the urge to protect him. We spent the next week in Houston, taking shifts at his father's bedside. Ryan's mother had died when he was 15, and his father was all the family he had left. During those long hospital hours, we talked more than we had in months. About his childhood, about his fears, about why he worked so hard. "I watched my dad struggle after Mom died," Ryan confessed one night as we sat in the hospital cafeteria, sharing stale coffee and vending machine sandwiches. "He worked 3 jobs to keep me in school, to make sure I had opportunities he never had. I swore I'd never let anyone I loved worry about money the way he did." "But what if the person you love would rather have you than the money?" I asked gently. Ryan looked at me with surprise, as if the thought had never occurred to him. "Is that what you want, Liv? Do you want me to be less ambitious?" It was the first time in years he'd asked what I wanted. And in that sterile hospital, surrounded by the machinery keeping his father alive, I couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth, that what I wanted was sitting in a downtown loft, probably wondering why I hadn't answered his texts in 3 days. Ryan's father survived, but something in Ryan had changed. He started coming home earlier, leaving his phone in his briefcase during dinner. He planned a weekend getaway to Austin, just the 2 of us, something we hadn't done in over 2 years. "I almost lost Dad," he said as we walked along Town Lake, watching kayakers navigate the gentle current. "It made me realize I could lose you too if I'm not careful. I should have ended things with Chris then. Should have given my marriage the second chance it deserved. But I was in too deep, and Chris was part of me now, like oxygen or blood or guilt." The night we returned from Austin, I texted Chris that I needed to see him. We met at Luna's, the same cafe where it all began. He looked different somehow, older, more serious. "I've been thinking while you were away," he said without preamble. "About us, about what we're doing." My heart stopped. Was he ending it? After everything we'd shared, all the promises about the future? "I've made a decision," he continued. "I'm telling my boss I'm leaving the gym. I found a space for the training studio. It's perfect, big enough for everything I've planned, affordable rent, room to grow." "Chris, that's wonderful, but I want you to be part of it," he interrupted. "Not just as my girlfriend but as my partner. You have a business degree, right? From SMU? You could handle the administrative side, the marketing. We could build something together, Olivia. Something that's ours." The offer was tempting, intoxicating even. A chance to be useful again, to use skills that had been dormant for years. But it would mean leaving Ryan, ending my marriage, starting over at 33 with a man who was still, in many ways, a beautiful stranger. "I need time to think," I said. "How much time?" Chris's voice carried an edge I'd never heard before. "Because I've been patient, Liv. I've been understanding about your situation, about your marriage. But I can't wait forever. I want a life with you, not stolen hours between your real life." That night, I lay awake next to Ryan watching him sleep. In the darkness, he looked younger, more like the man I'd married 8 years ago. His hand found mine under the covers, the way it used to when we were newlyweds. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine what it would be like if we could find our way back to each other. But morning brought reality. Ryan's phone started buzzing at 6 a.m. with calls about a project in San Antonio that was behind schedule. By the time I made coffee, he was already in his office, door closed, lost in spreadsheets and conference calls. I made my choice that day. I texted Chris, "Let's talk about the studio. I'm interested." We spent the afternoon looking at the space he wanted to lease, a converted warehouse in the arts district with soaring ceilings and huge windows. I could see his vision clearly: state-of-the-art equipment, small group training sessions, maybe even yoga classes and nutrition counseling. "The lease application requires 2 signatures, Chris explained, showing me the paperwork. "I can cover the startup costs, but having a co-signer would help us get better terms." I stared at the document, pen in hand. Signing would make our relationship official in a way that felt more binding than wedding vows. It would mean I was choosing Chris, choosing this new life he was offering. "What about Ryan?" I asked. "How do I tell him?" "The truth," Chris said simply. "That you're not happy, that you want something different. He's a reasonable man, isn't he? He'll understand." But I knew Ryan wouldn't understand. He'd be devastated, angry, betrayed. The affair was one thing, a mistake, a moment of weakness. But leaving him for another man, ending our marriage for a fantasy of what life could be like? That would destroy him. I signed the lease application anyway. 2 weeks later, everything changed again. I was late. Not fashionably late, not running behind schedule late. Late in the way that makes a married woman's hands shake as she stares at a calendar, counting and recounting days. The pregnancy test confirmed what I already knew in my heart. Positive. Undeniably, irreversibly positive. But here's the twist that makes this story truly tragic. I didn't know whose baby I was carrying. Ryan and I had been intimate during his father's health crisis. Grief and fear had driven us together in ways that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with him. But I'd also been with Chris during that same period, unable to stay away despite my best intentions. I sat on the bathroom floor of a Walgreens, staring at that little pink plus sign, and felt my world tilt off its axis. This should have been the happiest moment of my life. Ryan and I had been trying for a baby for years. But instead of joy, all I felt was terror. Chris was ecstatic when I told him. "This is perfect," he said, spinning me around his apartment like we were in a romantic comedy. "It's like the universe is telling us we're meant to be together. We can raise the baby in the studio. There's enough space in the back for a small apartment. It'll be unconventional, but it'll be ours." "Chris," I said quietly, "there's something you need to know." His face fell when I explained about Ryan, about the timing, about the uncertainty. For a long moment he just stared at me, processing the implications. "So you don't know," he said finally. "No. I don't know. We could find out. There are tests. Not until the 2nd trimester. And even then." I couldn't finish the sentence. Even then what? Would we raise the child based on DNA results? Would Ryan want a baby that might not be his? Would Chris accept a child that might belong to another man? That night, I made another decision that haunts me to this day. I scheduled an appointment at a women's clinic downtown. Not because I didn't want children, I desperately did. But because the uncertainty was eating me alive, and I couldn't bear the thought of bringing a child into such a mess of lies and betrayal. I didn't tell Chris about the appointment. I didn't tell Ryan about the pregnancy. I convinced myself I was protecting everyone, making the hard choice so others wouldn't have to suffer. But secrets have a way of surfacing like oil on water. 3 days before my appointment, Ryan came home early from work. I was in the kitchen, staring at prenatal vitamins I'd bought but hadn't taken, trying to decide if hope or guilt weighed more in my hands. Liv. Ryan's voice was strange, careful. We need to talk. My blood turned to ice water. He knew. Somehow, impossibly, he knew everything. I got a call today, he continued, setting his briefcase down with deliberate precision. From Dr. Morrison's office. About an appointment confirmation for Friday. Something about a procedure? Dr. Morrison. The gynecologist I'd been seeing for years. The one whose office had apparently called the wrong number, our home line instead of my cell. Ryan, I can explain. Are you pregnant? He asked simply. The question hung in the air between us like smoke. I could lie, make up a story about a different kind of procedure. But looking at Ryan's face, hopeful and terrified and heartbroken all at once, I couldn't do it. Yes, I whispered. The joy that flickered across his features was like a knife to my heart. For a split second he forgot about the appointment, forgot about the strange circumstances. He just heard that his wife was carrying the baby they'd been trying to have for years. But the appointment on Friday? He said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn. It's complicated, Ryan. Complicated how? His voice was getting quieter, more dangerous. Ryan never yelled when he was angry. He got very, very still. I told him everything. About Chris, about the affair, about not knowing whose child I was carrying. About the lease we'd signed, the plans we'd made, the life I'd been building behind his back. The words poured out of me like poison from a wound, ugly and necessary and devastating. Ryan listened without interruption, his face growing more composed with each revelation. When I finished, he sat in silence for a long time, staring at his hands. How long? He asked finally. 8 months. And the baby? I don't know. I'm sorry, Ryan. I'm so sorry, but I don't know. He stood up slowly, like an old man despite being only 35. I need some air, he said. When I come back, I want you to make a choice. What kind of choice? The baby lives or we're done. Not because of whose it might be, I'd raise any child you wanted to have. But because I won't stay married to someone who would end a pregnancy to avoid facing consequences. That's where I draw the line, Olivia. That's the one thing I can't forgive. He left me sitting in our kitchen, surrounded by the wreckage of 8 years of marriage and 8 months of lies. Chris was waiting for me when I arrived at his apartment an hour later, my face streaked with tears and my hands shaking. He knows, I said simply. Chris pulled me into his arms, and for a moment, I let myself believe that love could fix anything, that we could weather this storm together. What did he say? Chris asked. He gave me an ultimatum. Keep the baby or the marriage is over. Then the choice is easy, Chris said immediately. Keep the baby. Leave him. Come with me. We'll figure everything else out. But it wasn't easy. Nothing about this situation was easy. I spent that night at Chris's apartment, lying awake while he slept beside me, his hand protective on my still flat belly. This man loved me, wanted me, was willing to raise a child that might not be his. Why wasn't that enough? Why did I feel like I was drowning instead of being rescued? The next morning, I called the clinic and canceled the appointment. That afternoon, I drove home to face Ryan. I found him in his office, surrounded by cardboard boxes. He was packing up his desk, his awards, his photos, everything that made the room his. I'm moving out, he said without looking up. Henderson offered me a position in Denver. I'm taking it. Ryan, please. We can work through this. The baby isn't the issue, he interrupted. The issue is trust. The issue is that you've been living a double life for 8 months and I never suspected a thing. What does that say about us, Liv? About me as a husband, about you as a wife? He finally looked at me and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before, not anger, not hurt, but resignation. He'd already mourned our marriage and moved on. I'm not fighting for you, he continued, because you made your choice months ago. You chose him. The only reason you're here now is because you got caught. That's not true. I love you, Ryan. I've always loved you. Maybe. But you love him too. And I won't be anyone's second choice, not even yours. He handed me a manila envelope. Divorce papers. I'm not asking for much, just a clean break. The house is yours if you want it, or we can sell it and split the proceeds. I've already talked to Jim Henderson. I start in Denver next month. I stared at the papers, feeling like I was reading my own obituary. What about the baby? What about it? Ryan's voice was carefully neutral. If it's mine, I'll pay support and visit when I can. If it's not, he shrugged. Then you and Chris can raise it together like you planned. How can you be so cold about this? For the first time, Ryan's composure cracked slightly. Because if I'm not cold, I'll fall apart. And I've got too much work to do to fall apart right now. 3 weeks later, I miscarried. It happened on a Tuesday morning, sudden and brutal and final. Chris rushed me to the emergency room, held my hand while doctors confirmed what I already knew: the pregnancy was over. I'm sorry, the young resident said gently. Sometimes these things just happen. There's nothing you could have done differently. But I knew better. The stress, the guilt, the constant anxiety about paternity and the future, my body had simply given up on a pregnancy that existed in too much chaos to survive. Chris was devastated. He'd already bought baby clothes, had started shopping for cribs online. The loss hit him harder than it hit me, maybe because he'd had clearer dreams about what our child would be like. We can try again, he said as we sat in his apartment afterward, both of us hollow and exhausted. Once you're ready, we can have another baby. But I wasn't ready for anything. I wasn't ready for more lies, more complications, more choices between impossible options. The miscarriage felt like a sign, not from God or the universe, but from some deeper part of myself that knew I'd made too many wrong turns to find my way back to happiness. Ryan sent flowers to the hospital, white roses with a card that simply said, "I'm sorry for your loss." Not our loss. Your loss. He was already gone, emotionally and geographically, starting his new life in Colorado while I figured out what was left of mine. I ended things with Chris a month after the miscarriage. Not because I didn't care about him, but because what we'd built together was constructed on the ruins of my marriage, and foundations like that don't hold. I don't understand, he said when I tried to explain. We can get through this. We can be happy together. Can we? I asked. Really? Every time you look at me, don't you think about how we met? About what I did to my husband to be with you? If I could betray him, what makes you think I won't betray you someday? Chris had no answer for that because the question was unanswerable. Trust, once broken, leaves scars that never fully heal. Now, 2 years later, I'm living in a different house in a different neighborhood, working at a marketing firm downtown. I see Chris sometimes around the city. He did open his training studio and it's successful. He's dating someone now, a yoga instructor with kind eyes and no complicated history. They look happy together in the way that people look when their love isn't built on someone else's ashes. Ryan married his secretary last spring, a sweet woman named Amanda who he met in Denver. I know because she sent me a wedding announcement, along with a note thanking me for letting him go so he could find real happiness. There was no malice in the gesture, just genuine gratitude from a woman who clearly adores the man I couldn't appreciate when I had him. Sometimes I wonder about the child I lost, about whose baby it would have been. But mostly I try not to think about it. Some questions are better left unanswered, some paths better left unexplored. The divorce was finalized 6 months ago. Ryan kept his word. He was generous with the settlement, fair about the division of assets, civil in all our interactions. Even in ending our marriage, he was a better person than I deserved. These days, I'm learning to live with the choices I made. Not to forgive myself, I don't think I deserve that yet, but to accept that some mistakes are too big to undo, some betrayals too deep to heal. I tell myself this story isn't just about adultery or failed marriages or the price of secrets. It's about the moment when you realize that the life you thought you wanted isn't the life you were meant to have, and the terrible freedom that comes with destroying everything to start over. Would I make different choices if I could go back? I'd like to think so. I'd like to believe I would have talked to Ryan about my loneliness instead of seeking comfort elsewhere. I'd like to think I would have fought for my marriage instead of running from it. But truthfully, I'm not sure. Because the woman I was then, lonely, invisible, desperate to feel alive, she made the only choices that seemed possible at the time. And the woman I am now, older, sadder, undeniably wiser, she's living with the consequences of those choices every single day. That's the real tragedy of betrayal. Not just what it does to the people you hurt, but what it does to you, how it changes you from someone who deserves love into someone who questions whether she ever will again. I'm learning to live with that uncertainty. Some days are easier than others. But I'm learning. And maybe someday that will be enough. Thank you for watching the video to the end. Maybe YouTube will no longer offer you my channel, so subscribe to it by clicking subscribe on the right under the video to receive new interesting stories. Also on the right of the video there is a playlist with other interesting stories that you can listen to, and you can also write in the comments what stories you would like to see on the channel.